So with this final chapter, what we want to talk about is our ability to generalize to others. So one thing we've talked about quite a bit is this continuum of validity in between internal and external validity. So remember, internal validity is our ability to make causal statements about the relationships between variables. So in the ideal situation, internal validity would be assessed in a lab with very controlled settings. On the other end of the spectrum is external validity. External validity is the extent to which our findings can be generalized. So if we find a relationship between variables, does it actually exist, and is that relationship robust in real life, or does it only happen in the lab? So what we talk about in this chapter is our ability to generalize to other populations and some of the threats to generalization and how we can get around those threats. Because our book is a psychology textbook, a lot of the examples are taken from psychology. A lot of the citations that are used, a lot of the different concepts come from psychology. Research in psychology has drawn on samples of college students and have relied on samples of college students to do a lot of their studies. This is because they're easy access, they're pretty much a captive audience that are sometimes given course credit to do these kinds of participate in this research. So it's easy for psychologists to do research on their students. The problem is that college students are not exactly representative of the entire population. So you know that there's difference between people who go to college and those who don't, not just in their potential income in the future and maybe things like happiness and depression, but people that come into college are a highly restricted population. For the most part, they're young. Their social and political attitudes, are kind of changing and being developed. So college students, for the most part, are young and receptive and willing to consider different points of view. That's different than a lot of the population who may be older with more rigid views on society, on culture, on beliefs, and they don't want to make changes. So college students differ in that way from the general population. Also, to get into college, you had to pass some different kinds of examinations to get in. You had to complete high school. So the cognitive skills of college students are higher usually than the general population. Also, college students are usually more similar to one another than the population that's, everybody including college students, but not limited to the college students. You can consider this that college students are more homogeneous than the population. So everybody that's taking this class is more similar to one another than everybody that's outside, that is, I guess the community that you live in, either San Marcos or Austin or the surrounding communities. There's a lot more variation between people in the community than there is within the classroom. So that causes problems when we sample. We do either random sampling or convenience sampling from people that are in college, because then we do our study and we look at relationships between variables, and maybe we find a relationship that can't be generalized to the entire population because college students aren't representative of the entire population. So there's a lot of turmoil and there's a lot of, I guess, argument about, are the findings from these psychological studies generalizable to the entire population? Do they have external validity? Another group of individuals that are used in a lot of studies that are different from the general population are volunteers. So volunteers are the people that find maybe a request for participants on a community board, maybe at HEB or something like that. I don't even know if they still do that kind of thing. But people that volunteer to be parts of research. Now, sometimes they want to do it because there is a monetary incentive involved. Sometimes they just like to do, kind of contribute to research and that kind of thing. But people that volunteer are somewhat different than people that are not volunteers. So volunteers are usually more outgoing, more probably looking for new ideas, more receptive to new ideas and new attitudes. where non-volunteers, maybe people like me that are maybe a little bit more of a curmudgeon, aren't going to volunteer for things. And there's a lot of differences between the volunteer and the non-volunteer type that when you're doing research using only data from volunteers, the data may be different from what is obtained from a general sample of the community. A more narrow example of this is online research. So people that volunteer to do online research are not only volunteers, but they're also people that have access to the internet. They're tech savvy enough to use the internet to be able to, be comfortable on the internet and that kind of thing. So people that are completing online surveys are also a unique group where findings that we draw from those participants may not be generalizable to people that don't know how to use computers, that aren't volunteers. Another source of variation in results and data may be gender. So if we're interested in looking at the relationship between crowding and aggression, for example, and for whatever reason we're only able to get male participants, if we find a relationship between crowding and aggression for males, are we able to make a generalization that there's a relationship between crowding and aggression for females as well? Probably not, because men and women differ in all sorts of different aspects of their lives. So gender is another potential variable that can cause one's generalizations to not be that strong, to reduce the external validity of a study. So for gender, researchers should be aware of possible gender differences and, when possible, include both males and females in research investigations. Now, the actual location of where you're doing the study is a big factor in who you're able to generalize towards. So it's maybe not as prevalent this month as it was last month, but the example I talked about in class was the Confederate flag coming down in South Carolina. I think it was South Carolina. But the whole argument about should the Confederate flag be, allowed at the State House, and everything that was going on with that. So if we were actually in South Carolina and were, surveying people about their beliefs about the Confederate flag and should it be on government property, we might have a lot different response than if we asked people the same question, but we were in either California or British Columbia or all the other places that maybe don't have as much exposure to the Confederate flag and maybe don't know the history behind it, what it means in terms of race relations and those kinds of things. So the location is really important for questions, especially when the questions are particular to that location. So where you're drawing your sample from, that kind of restricts your external validity to that location or to that population. A lot of study is also done on non-human animals. So we use birds, rats, and mice in psychological research, and other kinds of animals are used in different kinds of research. So when we are studying a blood pressure drug and find that we can reduce the blood pressure in rats by giving them this drug, does that mean that we can reduce the blood pressure in humans by giving them that drug? Well, we don't really know. Hopefully we select animals based on their likeness to humans, but really we need to be able to make some, assumptions that these animals are similar to humans in ways that make research that utilizes them applicable to humans and generalizable to humans in the population. Now, these are a lot of threats to external validity, but also what we find is that there's usually not a huge difference in all of these, these kinds of ways that external validity can be threatened. In practice, what has been found in replications using different settings, using different subjects and a lot of stuff, is usually that if there's a strong relationship between two variables, or there's a strong difference in levels of a variable by gender or something like that, usually they exist in a lot of different settings. So the stronger the effect size, the stronger the relationship between variables, the more likely you're going to be able to find that relationship in different settings, in different populations, whether they're volunteers or non-volunteers, and that kind of thing. Culture is another really big factor in determining and evaluating your external validity. So a lot of the research that's done, research is kind of a luxury. So a lot of communities, I guess a lot of countries that don't have basic resources to keep the population healthy, they probably don't have the resources to do research either. So in Western industrialized nations, we have those resources. So all of the research that's done and a large body of scientific knowledge is based on only Western industrialized individuals. So all of this study that's done on, say, depression, is that applicable to other cultures? Is that applicable to, I guess, South America? Is that applicable to Africa or Asia? Well, we don't really know. What we have to do is test that and see if those findings and relationships are generalizable across other cultures. So I kind of like this acronym that sums that up, is that a lot of research is done only on weird people. So westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic individuals are kind of the backbone of the research that is done. They're the subject for the majority of research that's done in this world. So we really need to be careful in making statements about do research findings generalize to other cultures? Because for the most part, research is done on, individuals like myself. I can't speak for everybody else in the class, but, I'm a Western educated, industrialized, rich Democrat, relatively rich, as a professor, not really rich at all, but relative to other cultures, I am. So that needs to be taken into account. Now, we've talked about generalizing to other populations. It's also important to consider that the methods that are used influence generalizability and external validity. So in experimental research, for the most part, research is only done using one experimenter, and the characteristics of this experimenter, or the person doing the research, can influence the results, meaning those findings can only be generalizable in settings when the experimenter was similar. So think about things. We've talked about experimenter bias and expectancy effects. So if I'm the researcher and I know what the outcome should be, I may bias the results that way. But also my gender, personality, and experience can influence how people would respond to questions or even behavioral measures and that kind of thing. So depending on the sensitivity of questions, gender may be an issue, the researcher's personality. So if the experimenter is very nice and warm and welcoming, you may respond differently than if the experimenter is very instrumental and cold and really kind of matter of fact. You might respond differently to those kinds of individuals. Also, their experience. So if I came in to a class and ran an experiment, people may respond differently than if somebody that's just getting close to retirement, that looks very experienced, very groomed, maybe wearing a lab coat and that kind of thing, somebody that looks like more of an authority figure, they might respond differently to that. So you can imagine in the Milgram experiments, if somebody that was, looked young and untrained was the person telling the individual to increase the voltage of the shocks, they may not do it. But since that person looked older, experienced, authoritative, they were probably more likely to administer higher levels of shock to the person on the other side of the wall. So experience has a big impact on how people respond. Now, a solution to this problem of one experimenter is to use two or more experimenters, and that has variability. So maybe have one young female that is, has a, I guess, more instrumental personality, and then you can have an older male that's warm, and maybe even 3 experimenters. So you get variability in your experimenters. So the results aren't contingent on just one person and their characteristics, but a whole range of individuals that help conduct the experiment. So another methodological consideration when assessing external validity is whether a pretest was used in the experiment. So we know that pretests really help us create stronger experimental designs because they help us confirm that the groups are equivalent to begin with. So in the end, and when we do our post-test, we don't attribute the difference between groups to the experimental effect, but rather maybe those groups were different to begin with. Also, it helps us assess mortality effects to see if there's a relationship between who dropped out of the study and being in the control or the experimental group. Now, in relation to generalizability, pretests pose a problem to us because they limit the ability to generalize to populations that did receive a pretest. So if our study was done with a pretest, we know that pretests can cue people into what the research question is, so maybe they respond differently to the experimental variable than they would if there was not a pretest. So that limits our ability to generalize to the population because our data comes from only individuals that had a pretest. So that is problematic. One way to alleviate this is to go back and remember we talked about the Solomon 4-group design, is to pretty much run the experiment on 2 different groups, one that gets post-test only and one that gets pre-test and post-test. So then you can actually see in the end, was there an effect of the pre-test? So was maybe the difference between the experimental and control group greater for individuals that received a pre-test than that difference was for individuals who did not receive a pretest. In this continuum that I started talking about in here of external to internal validity, is that internal validity is really strong in lab settings. So in the lab, when we have the ability to control all of the possible confounding variables and precisely measure the outcome, precisely measure and define the independent variable, we have high internal validity. But this is kind of you can imagine a teeter-totter. When we have high internal validity, the external validity starts to decrease. Now, individuals, researchers have argued against this and said, well, it doesn't really matter. So when we're in a lab in a very controlled setting, where everything is in a vacuum and there's no extraneous variables and we're testing the relationship between 2 things, it doesn't really matter if we can't generalize those findings to the population. So when we're talking about maybe atomic particles, when we're looking at those in the lab and looking at the relationship between 2 different atomic particles, does it even matter if we can't say how that's related to everyday life? It really doesn't. It's a different level of scientific knowledge that they're finding in these labs. So generalization in these contexts to real life settings is not relevant when the purpose of the study is to investigate causal relationships. Now, that's one response. I think a more cautious response is to say, okay, do your lab studies, have that high internal validity, but then do those experiments in the field. So we talked about field experiments, and we're taking our experimental design out of the lab and doing it in everyday settings. So looking if there's a relationship between these atomic particles outside of the vacuum, in other contexts and that kind of thing. So what that does is it helps support the original findings, and it also shows individuals that those findings are robust and they're not just occurring within the lab, but they occur in real life settings as well. Now, With all this said, what we want to do is have good external validity whenever we can. So if you're an atomic particle scientist, maybe external validity is not that important to you. But for us as social scientists, external validity is important because we want to be able to generalize our findings to the largest population possible. One way to start with good external validity is to get a good sample. So we can, if possible, use a census. So remember, this means to measure everybody, or a random sample, which in real life application gets used a lot more because it's less expensive. We're able to make generalizations to the population, all of these things that we've talked about, especially in the last chapter. But if we have a good random sample, we'll be able to produce better external validity. So how we choose our individuals is really important. Another way to think about external validity that helps you kind of determine whether your results are generalizable is to think of generalization as a statistical interaction. So remember that an interaction occurs when a relationship between variables exists under one condition but not another. So maybe there's a relationship between crowding and aggression for males but not for females. Also, you can think of an interaction as the nature of the relationship is different in one condition than the other. So when we're creating our study, what we would probably want to do is think about this factorial design and think about all of the possible characteristics of individuals that could have an interaction, or could create an interaction between that variable and then the independent variable and the dependent variable of focus. So finding these interaction effects is contingent on including other variables in the research design, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. So in this example, we're looking at the relationship between crowding and aggression, and I've talked about this somewhat. This should be familiar to you because we've looked at similar slides, similar figures when we've talked about interactions. So imagine we're interested in the relationship between crowding and aggression. In graph A, this shows that there's no difference between males and females. So there's not an interaction between gender and the relationship between crowding and aggression. So if we only measured females in this example, it wouldn't matter because there's no difference between females and males. Graph B, this also shows that there's no interaction. While we see that there's differences in the starting points, or really the difference across the entire spectrum of crowding, that males have higher aggression than females no matter what the level of crowding is. This is interesting and shows us that maybe we should measure males and females differently, but it doesn't indicate an interaction. Now graphs C and D, these do show interactions. So if we were to only measure the relationship between crowding and aggression for males, and the relationship was as pictured in graph C, then we would make an error by saying that males and females have a similar relationship between crowding and aggression. So in this case, gender is one of those factorial measures that we need to take into account, because without it, we wouldn't be able to generalize to the other gender or the other sex. Graph D is another example of this, and this is like a classic interaction where there's differences at the beginning between males and females, and as the level of crowding increases, the level of aggression for males and females actually flips over. So this is a really strong interaction. So you can imagine in graph D, if we only measured males, we would be so far off the mark of the relationship between crowding and aggression for females. And we wouldn't know that because all we would have is male measures. So in this case, we want to protect ourselves by taking into account these potential interactions. So measuring gender, measuring race and ethnicity, basically measuring as many variables as possible that we think are related to the outcome. Another way to support external validity is to replicate the study. Now there's two kinds of ways that studies are replicated. There's an exact replication. So this is attempting to precisely replicate the procedures of a study. This happens when somebody publishes findings that are very unique, very counterintuitive. We call the term novel. Research is novel when it's new. People have not reported on this concept or this relationship before. This is when exact replication occurs a lot because people want to see if they can replicate the results. Our book talks about exposure to the works of Mozart, and I think it was kids' IQ or kids' reading abilities or something, math abilities. What they found was the relationship between the exposure to that music and intelligence couldn't be replicated, even in the exact same setting that the original research was reported in. Now, that kind of, sometimes that's not a bad thing. Maybe there was differences. So we talked about last chapter in, what happens if you find that there's not a relationship. Well, there's a lot of reasons why it might not exist, sample size, effect size, and those kinds of things. But we would want to use exact replication to verify unique findings, verify rare findings. Now, conceptual replication, this is much more important, and I use this term robust, and hopefully you understand that as kind of an indicator of how flexible something is and in how many different contexts can something occur. So when I say if a relationship is robust to the setting and even robust to the way that things are measured, that means that there's a strong relationship between them. So in a conceptual replication, we could operationalize the independent and dependent variables in different ways. So let's say we're talking about the relationship between income and depression. Depression can be measured a bunch of different ways, as can income. So maybe we can measure income, maybe we measure assets. We measure assets in terms of earned assets versus those that are inherited. A lot of different ways that we can define what we think income is or those monetary resources. So if we find that there's a relationship between income and depression in one setting, in one kind of operationalization of those variables, what we want to do is test that in another setting. So we test that in the United States. Then we test that in Asia using different measures of the independent and dependent variables. If we find a relationship that occurs in all of these different settings, all of these different operationalizations, we would say that that relationship is robust. This is important for really verifying and confirming that a relationship exists because, going back to generalization, we want to be able to say that that relationship exists for all people, or we want to know the limits of who we can generalize to. So if we can replicate these studies in a bunch of different settings, it really helps us trust the findings. It helps us really believe in the fact that there's a relationship between these variables. We've talked about threats to generalizability. We've talked about ways to enhance external validity, generalizability. Now we want to talk about how people evaluate generalizability. Now, literature reviews, similar to what you're doing for your final paper, but I'm having you focus on methods a little bit more. A literature review is really important. So this is a qualitative way to summarize the findings in a given area of research and identify whether that relationship is strongly supported or is it weakly supported. So in a literature review on income and depression, we would summarize all of those studies that we found across all the different cultures, all the different settings, all the different operationalizations, and we compare and contrast the findings. We say, in what settings was this relationship strong? What settings was it weak, excuse me? And what it does, it helps us expose inconsistent findings in areas that are maybe lacking proper research, what studies were not strong, which studies were, methodologically strong. And this gives us an idea and gives us direction for future research. So this is what, in the articles that you chose, most all research articles that are empirical, original research start with a literature review, because what you want to do is frame your research question and say, okay, I'm interested in the relationship between income and depression. Here's what everybody else has found. Here's what I'm going to add to that, because you don't want to just do redundant research. You want to do something that is new, that's contributing to the literature. And that's what a literature review helps you do, is narrow down all of the findings that have been previously done. Hopefully you can't hear my barking dogs. And then it gives you a new place to start. So that's where you're going to start your research, is saying, this is everything that's been done. Here's how I can contribute to that. That's when you would talk about your actual research hypotheses and go into doing something new. Meta-analysis is another way to evaluate generalizations. So literature reviews are a qualitative way to assess how much research has been done on a given subject, the quality of the research, how strong the findings are. Meta-analysis is a quantitative way of doing that. So all of those studies that we collected on the relationship between income and depression, all of those that had statistical estimates, so those that measured the strength of the relationship between income and depression, we would take all of those and put those into their own data set. So each of those different studies would become an observation. What we would do is we would be able to then look at the consistency of the effect across all of these different studies. So it would allow us to compare the effect sizes of the relationship in different types of studies, giving us a sense of overall, on average, was there a relationship between these variables across all of the studies. So in comparison to a literature review that allows us qualitative conclusions, really, kind of a general formed opinion on the relationship between the variables, a meta-analysis allows us to actually use statistics and say, with 95% confidence, we can say that there is a relationship between income and depression across all of these studies. And that's really important, and it provides a lot of support to a literature review, because literature review can sometimes be opinionated, sometimes they're more biased, I would say, where meta-analyses, as long as there is a good, I guess, holistic view of all the research that's being done in one given setting, then a meta-analysis will really give you strong results and a strong grounding to say, is there a relationship between these variables? Now, in the end, and the book, I think, kind of tries to give you a very grand finale of the book, even though it's maybe not that strong, is that the reason we want to generalize is to help improve people's lives, to help improve the, I guess, knowledge, so not only to create scientific knowledge, but to implement that and to produce from that. Now, what we produce from our findings depends on what our goal was. So in psychological research and sociological research, social sciences generally, what we want to do is help increase the health of the population. We want to increase justice for individuals in the terms of law and criminality. We want to make education more effective, more available to individuals. So those are things that, there are these really big picture ideas, and that's what we want to get at. And that's why generalizability is important, is we want to generalize to a population so we can help that population. Now, a lot of research is done only in I don't want to say capitalistic, but a work environment. So the point of research is to increase profit, so Facebook does a lot of research on who uses different kinds of features, what advertising is effective to individuals, and the point of that is to make Facebook more money, and that's fine. But if they want to make good money and solid findings, they still need to have research that has good external validity, because they want to be able to make sure that the findings, or maybe the associations that they're finding, are robust in all of the people that use Facebook, not just a small segment of them. So it's really important to focus on that generalizability. And I think basically, at least going back to social science and the kinds of things we do in our department here, is we want to improve people's lives. So we want to increase people's happiness, their well-being, their, I guess, self-esteem. We want to make sure people live healthy lives. So we want to reduce obesity, reduce nutritional deficiencies, and those kinds of things. And those are really important. So it depends on how careful we are about selecting our participants, about designing our research. The important part of that is, if we do it right, then we can make people happy and healthy. And then for those business-minded folks, we can also make you rich. It just is really important that we have a methodological design that enables that. So it needs to take into account both the internal validity of the questions being asked, and then the external validity of who can we generalize these research results to.